Thank you, Joe, and welcome back. Ma'am, would you mind calling roll?
Councilmember Miller,
Present.
Councilmember Woolsey, Mayor Pro Tem Venable,
Here.
Mayor Thorpe.
Here.
Absent from today's meeting is Councilmember Bieber.
Do we have any public comment?
We have no public comments.
Okay. Then we can start our training.
Yes.
I think we're going to stay up here.
Thank you, Mayor and Council, and welcome to your biannual mandatory public ethics training. I am Stephen Grand Pacifico, your city attorney, joined by the city manager and city clerk. And we are going to dive right in. I do apologize. The only prescription glasses I have with me are my sunglasses. So while I have printed out a copy of the presentation, I may occasionally be putting my sunglasses up to my eyes so that I can see the wording on the slide. I promise I'm not trying to be cool. If I was, I would not have become a city attorney. A little bit about your city attorney firm, Cole Huber. We are a full service law firm. As you can tell, this is occasionally a marketing slide deck. We do this for free for things like CSDA and others. Never hurts to put an 8-year-old picture of me up in the ethics slide deck. This is a disclaimer for those members of the public that may be watching the stream or attending in person. This presentation is not legal advice. It is designed to be an overview of local ethics laws, should be read as a general guide. While I actively encourage you to interrupt me and talk about situations that maybe have been on your mind, just keep it in mind that this is not an attorney-client privileged conversation. We are at a public meeting right now. If you would like to get specific legal advice about a particular issue that is on your mind, it may be beneficial for us to have that conversation offline. One of the things that I like to make sure we're doing as we do a presentation like this, this is not a law school seminar on public ethics laws. This is an overview of public ethics laws that are applicable to local government agencies. My hope in leaving this presentation is not that you will be able to cite chapter and verse of FPPC regulations. My hope is that in leaving this, both you, staff, members of the public, will know the general contours of public ethics laws so that when you're faced with a situation, you will be like, hey, I seem to remember that was discussed in the presentation we had with the city attorney. I better give the city attorney a call, or I better call the FPPC hotline and look it up. Okay, so for that reason, you can look at this as a 30,000 foot view of public ethics laws. I also get on my soapbox a lot. My job as legal counsel is to tell you what the legal requirements are. When we're talking about public ethics laws, these are the minimum requirements for public service. This is not necessarily the standard we should be holding ourselves to. So in addition to talking about what the law requires, we will sometimes talk about maybe not what we have to do, but maybe what we should do. Because I found that if you operate in that manner, at that higher level, you will rarely have issues with the ethics laws themselves. One of the tests that we'll be talking about a lot is if they published it on the front page of the local newspaper, if they published everything that happened, would you be satisfied with the public knowing what had occurred? If the answer is yes, then oftentimes you don't need to go into a legal analysis because if the public is fine with the facts as they occurred, there usually isn't a legal issue. If you are concerned with the facts of what transpired being published and being public, oftentimes that may be a red flag that perhaps there is a legal concern with what's occurring. The key concept that we want to talk about is that your actions have to be in the public interest. As a public official, you don't sit on the dais for yourself. You are not there representing yourself and your own personal interests, financial interests or otherwise. You are there representing the entire city of Yucaipa. Even though you've been elected by district, you represent the entire city, and collectively you are supposed to act for the greater public good. Something we'll also be talking about, and this goes back to the newspaper scenario, is that perception is as important as reality. That is true with everything we do. There is the law, there are the facts, and then there's the public perception of whether it was correct or not to do something. And so that's always something to also be thinking about. I start off with a really easy question. What are ethics? And I invite any member of the council who wants to try to give an answer to that question. This is supposed to be participatory. It's one of the requirements, actually. So if anyone wants to raise their hand, I don't want to call anyone out or put anyone on the spot. But I know that Mayor Pro Tem Venable in the past, when I've done these, has been more than gracious to participate and give these things a go. And you've sat through this presentation before, so I don't know if you want to give it a try, or if anyone else wants to give it a go. Don't be shy. Okay, that's fine. So we took a pass on the softball. I want you guys to know my questions don't get easier. Ethics are what we ought to do. That's how I define it. I'm sure if you look it up in Webster, there's a much better definition of what ethics are. I define it as what we ought to do. Ethics laws are what you have to do or you go to jail. And so I think we can all agree that there are, perhaps, Mayor, in your experience, there are the traffic laws. That's how you have to drive. But that doesn't make you a good driver if all you follow are the traffic laws, right? Same thing, in construction, right? There are the minimum requirements, minimum safety requirements. That doesn't make you a good operator. When we're talking about what makes us a good public official, yes, following the ethics laws is required, but it isn't necessarily what we should be striving to. So when we talk about what we ought to do, these are things these are values that we have generally in this community and in our democracy. And what we look for in our public officials. We want our public officials to be trustworthy. We want them to be loyal to the agency, to their residents. We want them to be responsible with their authority and with their position. We want them to respect their residents, their businesses, each other, staff. We want them to act with fairness. So you're going to oftentimes have applications and people coming before you. We wouldn't need a city council if we didn't have difficult decisions to make. And so that oftentimes requires balancing different interests, sometimes putting one interest above another. That requires fairness. And then lastly, we look for compassion in our public officials. Attorneys, we oftentimes get accused of being sort of cold-hearted and calculating. I don't know if that's law school or if it's just the kind of person who goes. But I think, no one wants to live in a city that's run by a city attorney. That's why we have city councils. They're looking for compassion for the people that we serve. So I promise there's not a slide for each one of these values. Hold on, let me double check that. Yeah, there's only one. Responsibility. I think in particular, I like to go into that one. It's about making decisions on behalf of the public. Keeping in mind that collectively, the residents and businesses of our community provide a substantial amount of their own funds, their own income, their own value that they've generated, and they provide that to the city for the common benefit, to provide for public safety and other services. And they expect this government, and especially the city council, to be good stewards of those funds that they've worked hard for. We've talked about perception matters. You're going to see that a lot. There is being a good steward, and then there is being seen being a good steward and being perceived as being good stewards. And we have to make both of those things happen. Because even if we make all the right decisions, if the public doesn't understand that, if we are not communicating that, if we are not being seen as making the right decisions, then faith in their local government is hurt by that, and it causes issues. Lastly, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, personal and organizational ethics. In my experience, you have an ethical local government when you have ethical local leaders. It starts at the top. If our city council acts ethically, honorably, and meets those values that I talked about, that filters down to the entire organization, as an example. On the flip side, if you have public officials who are not acting ethically, the fish rots from the head, as they say, and it trickles down throughout the entire organization. So, understanding ethics laws. Why should you care? That's usually where I start. Well, you should care because there are consequences. Everything in life has consequences, so does breaking local ethics laws. Criminal penalties. This is, jail and or prison. 6 months to 20 years in prison, depending on the violation. Civil penalties, including fines of up to $250,000, as well as restitution, which is money that may have been improperly obtained being given back, as well as forfeiture. Attorney's fees. So, sometimes people fly a little close to the sun, they walk a little close to the line. Maybe what they did wasn't provable to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt to be criminal. However, there are significant costs of even getting that acquittal, including attorney's fees, over $1 million in some cases. And then lastly, the reputation costs. I've known many former public officials throughout my career, some of who have had to resign due to scandal, some who've had to resign due to a plea agreement with the Public Integrity Unit or with federal authorities. And it takes a very strong personal toll. These are people who, were pillars of the community. They were seen, they were well liked, and they become a social pariah in their own city because of some of these things, and they become very diminished. And so I think for all of those reasons, the personal, the financial, those are all good reasons to be concerned about the consequences of violating ethics laws. So there are 4 categories that we're going to be going over today. We're going to start with the easiest ones to understand. Those are what I call personal financial gain, and those include things like bribery, self-dealing, and employment issues. And then we'll continue on through what I think are more complex and more subtle, and more easy to get entangled in. So things like personal advantages and perks. We'll go on to government transparency. These are the disclosure forms like the Form 700s, charitable fundraising. We're going to go quickly through the Brown Act because we actually have a separate presentation entirely on the Brown Act. I found that is the one that generates a significant amount of both interest from the public officials as well as public interest, so I'd like to do that one separately. And then lastly, we'll talk about what I think are the most challenging, even for professional staff, fair processes. So these are things like quasi-judicial hearings, due process, ex parte communications. That's where we go from the obviously I shouldn't take a bribe to the what do you mean I can't talk to the barber about that upcoming conditional use permit, right? So we're gonna go through these sort of step by step. Group 1, personal financial gain, the easy ones. And we're going to be always talking about the actual issue. So we're going to be talking about what is bribery, right? I think everyone kind of has an idea of what bribery is. And get ready because I'm going to ask you guys if anyone wants to give me a definition or an attempt at a definition. I'm giving it to you well in advance, so you're ready. But I think if we, again, start with those 30,000-foot principles, what we ought to do, how we ought to behave, the value here is that the public's interest should be the sole motivating factor when you as a public official are engaging in your duties. You should not be benefiting financially from the position on city council. I think one or more of you, may have even been the mayor, was talking about how this is public service, right? This is not public employment up here. This is public service. Although there is a small amount of payment for your time, the fact is this is not anyone's job. And if we took the amount of hours that I know you all devote to what you do up on the dais and out in the community, you'd certainly be earning well below minimum wage at this point. So, examples of financial gain, like we'll talk about, bribery, self-dealing, and employment-related prohibitions. Oh, I was going to ask you for the definition of bribery, and then I put up a slide with it on it. Sorry. So that's the act of persuading someone to act in one's favor by gift or something of value. That is not the penal code definition of bribery for those of you up there who are post-certified, but it is good enough for this presentation. A public official cannot solicit which means ask for, receive, or agree to receive in the future. So that's 1, 2, 3, can't do any of those things. A benefit in exchange for their official actions. So if we were looking at the elements of bribery, those are the 3 elements of bribery. Let me look at the slides here, make sure I don't get ahead of myself here. Okay, so benefits, right? This does not just mean a bag of money, right? It could be expensive gifts. It could be future employment opportunities. Essentially, it could be doing a favor for a friend. It could be a future contracting opportunity. It could be anything that has a pecuniary value, a financial value to you. And the important thing to remember is that it's in exchange for your official duties. So this is where that Latin phrase quid pro quo comes from. It means this for that, right? And so I will vote yes on your tow franchise agreement if you hand me that bag of cash. So that's the easy one, and unfortunately one that I've seen in my career. And like I said, those are the easy ones. Sometimes they get a little bit more challenging, right? And so I think you want to, you want to think about what you would say in advance. I think that's my advice on this. I think one, it's shocking to me that this still happens with any kind of regularity. And it does. It does. There are people operating in this world who will approach public officials and attempt to get an advantage on a decision they have coming forward. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens more than I think makes sense. So I always recommend thinking about what you're going to say in advance, because you don't want to be surprised when this may happen to you. I would also say be aware that there are some cultural differences between how business is done in the United States and California and how business may be done elsewhere in the world. As we may encounter property owners or business owners who primarily operate elsewhere on the planet, sometimes they are not fully apprised of the public ethics laws that exist. And you'll see this with gifts as well. Sometimes they may think that it is expected or required. So just be prepared to say, that's not how we do business here. I'd like to talk about the merits of the project if we're going to talk about it at all. Bribery penalties, prison, loss of office, barred from ever holding office again, fines and restitution, so you may have to pay the bribe back to the government agency. And then federal prosecution. So those are state level penalties. The federal government loves going after local government officials for violation of ethics laws. They love doing perp walks with local government officials. We even have a dedicated unit here based in Riverside, the Public Integrity Unit, who is oftentimes joint working between local and federal authorities on these types of issues. Any questions about bribery? Okay. Usually no one wants to ask about any fun factual scenarios in this. I don't hold it against you. Self-dealing rules. So these are disqualifications and conflicts of interest, and then special rules for contracts. So here's the general rule. And so this is under the Political Reform Act and FPPC regulations. So this is one that comes up very often, and I want to be really clear. Disqualifying yourself because of a financial interest is not a problem. It's expected. You all live in the community. Some of you work in the community. Some of you may now or have in the past owned businesses in the community. That means that your livelihood and your property, your income, your investments, it's expected that you will have all of those things within the community that you are elected to represent. And eventually, it is expected that there will be a conflict between those personal financial interests that you have and the interests of the city of Yucaipa. That doesn't mean that you would vote differently. That doesn't mean you would vote against the interests of the city. However, this is one of those instances where even the potential for a conflict results in disqualification, which means you are not permitted under the law to vote. Does anyone know some of the reasons like you would be disqualified from voting on a particular item? Mayor?
It was like 500 feet from my house.
Mayor Pro Tem, correct. So that was an instance where you had a property interest, so you owned or leased property that was close to a project that the city was looking at approving. And even though we're all certain you could be fair-minded, right, and make a decision in the best interest of the city, under state law, the presumption is that if something is happening that close to your house, for example, it's very hard to be fair, or at least the public perception that you'd be fair would be damaged. So that is an example that we go through all the time with you, with all of the council members. It's important to keep in mind where you own property. It's important to look at where projects are being approved. And it's not just the council. We have to keep that in mind for our other public officials who reside or own property in the city. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. That's an excellent example. Yes?
It was brought up during my campaign about me living in a mobile home park.
Mm-hmm.
I was told I would have to excuse myself with anything. We kind of talked about this,
Sure.
but let's clarify it again.
That's great. So there are very specific rules when it comes to conflicts of interest related to your residence. And there are exceptions for when they affect the public generally. It's going to require that we do a little bit of math, which is not my strong suit as the attorney. So I think for now, let's make sure we have a flag on it. So obviously, you live in a mobile home park. We do regulate significantly mobile home parks here in the city. We'd want to look at what is that action and would it have a financial effect on you? And then if so, is that effect on you different than the public generally? I don't remember which district has the most mobile home parks. Is it yours? Okay, I thought it might be. So we may actually be able to write an opinion letter where you were allowed to continue as long as you do not have a direct financial interest. But we would need to do the math on that one because that one's a little tricky. We've done it before, and I'm glad to say that in the past we did have a group of citizens who challenged that ethics opinion, and the FPPC upheld it. So we could undergo a similar analysis for you.
You want to talk about what the formula is, the percentage, how that works?
I do, but it depends on the circumstances. It could be 25% or 15%. So I'd want to dive into it. But generally speaking, if we're looking at your district, so they call it the geographical area that you are elected from, if a certain percentage of the residents in your geographical area would be subject to the same rule, then you are permitted to participate. And that's why you living in the district with a significant concentration of mobile home parks would be relevant.
Now, let me throw something else in on that.
Let's add to it. Let's go.
Okay. My park is not considered a mobile home park. We are listed with the state as an RV club.
Okay, so Title 25.
So whatever it is, we're listed with 25, or with the state as an RV park. So we don't really fall into a lot of the mobile home rules and things.
So that would make it easier to give you clearance to participate in decisions if they are not applicable to you or your park specifically.
Right.
So I like I said, I think it's an interesting thing. So we keep pretty good tabs on each of the general conflict issues that may arise with each of you. So we try to keep track of the property you guys own and what industries you work in.
Right.
And so, for this one, that's a rather interesting detail. But I think it tends to result in you being able to vote on more things rather than less.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. But let's. This is one of those things where maybe an attorney-client communication offline would be very beneficial.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we talked about property. Besides property interest, thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Does anyone else have any other financial interests that would potentially disqualify them from participating in a decision.
Mine would be my source of employment because of who we currently contract our law enforcement services through.
That's correct. So, and speaking of special circumstances, this is one of them where, because the mayor is an employee of a government entity, we are not prohibited from entering into that contract. We are not generally prohibited from entering into contracts with the county or with the sheriff's department specifically, but the mayor does have to recuse himself off of contract-related matters related to the sheriff's department. Okay, so those are the two big ones. So there are some others, but we'll leave it there. But think to yourself, if this would impact my financial situation, the value of my property, the value of my other investments. Maybe you own a significant portion of a local business that would be affected. Maybe you own a lot of rental homes, right? And we're talking about rental regulations. Just kind of be thinking, would this affect my financial interests particularly? And it doesn't have to, it doesn't have to be negative, right? It could be good for you and good for the community at the same time. Could be a win-win, as they say. But if there is an effect either way, we're still going to require disqualification under the rules. I put a couple case studies, so you guys have talked about some issues that were on your mind. These are a couple of case studies that have actually happened during my career. A planning commissioner owns a parcel of land in a residential zone. A developer files an application to change the zoning for the area to commercial, including that planning commissioner's land. If approved, the value of the planning commissioner's property would significantly increase. Does the planning commissioner need to disqualify themselves? Yes, I'm seeing nods. Yes, the answer is yes. And that one is because the value of the planning commissioner's property is being directly affected, right? So this isn't even nearby, being directly affected. Case study number 2. A council member's spouse is an executive at a manufacturing company in the city. The city is considering adopting stricter business regulations, which would increase the operating costs for the manufacturing company and potentially affect the company's profitability and their spouse's compensation. Should they disqualify themselves from that decision-making process? Seeing more yes, right? So under California law, your spouse's income is your income, right? And so if this is going to potentially affect the income of your spouse, it's going to potentially affect your income. You'll notice on your financial disclosure forms, you have to also disclose the income of your spouse. One of the exceptions is if your spouse works for another public agency. So make sure you read through the exact rules on that Form 700. Case study 3. City is considering a renovation project at a public park. New playground equipment, new landscaping, and additional recreational areas. One of the council members have children that frequently go to the park. They love that park. Should they disqualify themselves? I'm seeing some no's. Bold? No? Okay, you know what? Councilmember Miller was the first no, and it was said with gusto. Councilmember Miller, do you want to take a shot at why you think disqualification would not be necessary in this case? It affects them the same as any other member of the public, right? Anyone is capable of using that park just because their children happen to enjoy it. In fact, that's something we should be happy with and celebrate, right? Just because they happen to enjoy it doesn't mean that they have a financial interest in that. Now, if they happen to be selling park equipment to the city or something like that, we'd have a different issue. But simply using the park in the same way that any other member of the public would, not an issue. This is city attorney trigger, which is the improper use of the words disqualification versus abstention. I will never correct you on the distinction during a public meeting, but I will turn to the city clerk and make sure she uses the correct word in the records of the meeting that you then approve at the next one. Disqualification means legally required, that you cannot participate. It does not imply any wrongdoing. The only wrongdoing is not disqualifying when you were supposed to, right? It was very hard to find a sticker that said I didn't vote, by the way, and the city clerk did not approve. Abstention is voluntary. So this is when the law is not requiring that you disqualify yourself. But nevertheless, sometimes, and this happens, and I can completely understand the circumstances, you may have a council member who says, look, spoke with the city attorney. I am not legally required to disqualify myself. However, I feel that the perception of fairness demands that I step away from this, so I'm going to abstain from participating in this decision. That's perfectly okay. The importance is drawing that distinction, making it clear that I'm voluntarily stepping away from this decision and why, versus being legally required to do so. When you disqualify yourself, oh, never mind. That's another slide. Okay, so how do you get advice on the Political Reform Act, on financial disqualifications and such? So the first one is agency counsel. That's me, city attorney's office. Easier to obtain, but does not come with immunity from prosecution. Let me rephrase. It comes with immunity for me. So if I give you bad advice and you follow it, I cannot be prosecuted or have anything bad befall me because I gave bad advice and you followed it. I know. This may surprise you. Lawyers wrote that rule, okay? However, if you follow my advice, even in good faith, if I'm wrong, you could still be liable. Now, I think you'd have a very good defense to any kind of criminal prosecution. Reliance on counsel is what it's called. You may still get stuck with a fine from the FPBC. Very rare. You'll find most city attorneys, this one included, tend to give relatively conservative advice when it comes to financial disqualifications. If it is certain that you will be fined, usually because I can find a FPBC advice letter on point, and that happens, I will give you that advice letter, tell you why I'm giving you the advice. Otherwise, I'm probably going to give you what the risk is for a violation. And generally speaking, I've found that when there's even a question in your agency's counsel, most public officials say, well, if the city attorney has a question, the public would probably have a question. And so for that reason, even if I'm not disqualified, I'm going to abstain. But sometimes it's really important. Sometimes it is a matter of intense community concern to people who elected you. And to walk away from it, some council members feel that that would not be performing their duties. If that's the case, I will get you a memo and you can rely on it. Otherwise, we can always ask the FPBC, that is the Fair Political Practices Commission, that is a state agency, and they are capable and responsible to give legal advice to public officials on these exact situations. You can send them an email or a letter saying, here are the facts, can I participate under the Political Reform Act? So one thing, they will only analyze the Political Reform Act. They are not going to analyze any other elements of the law, right? So we're talking about the Political Reform Act now, but we were talking about bribery earlier. We're going to be talking about the Brown Act later. We're going to be talking about campaign finance laws. They don't regulate any of those things or give advice on those things, right? But the advantage, if you get it from the FPBC, is that you have immunity. If you follow what they've told you to do, you cannot be prosecuted. I would say generally they're pretty conservative too when they give their advice. If you're interested, both in how the Political Reform Act is applied and also just seeing kind of juicy drama that goes on in other cities, you can go on the FPBC website and look up their ethics letters, and you will see all sorts of factual scenarios that would make your head spin and see the questions that come up. And you'll get to see actually how they answer it. And something you'll notice is that when you ask for advice letters from our office, our advice letters tend to follow the same format as the FPPC because we follow the same analysis that they do. If you are disqualified, I believe that is Uncle Sam saying shh. If you are disqualified, do not discuss or influence either staff or colleagues. So I cannot emphasize this enough. If you have a disqualification, that does not only apply to when you're sitting at the dais. That applies all the time, right? So you don't get to call the city manager and say, hey, look, I'm disqualified on this project down the street from my house, but let me tell you, sir, if that thing gets approved, I'm going to be very upset, right? You are not allowed to call staff. You're not allowed to call your colleagues. You can't say, look, I'm disqualified, so I'm not going to be able to participate in that decision, but I need you to know I really don't want it to happen, okay? No talking about it with anyone, except me. You talk to me, okay? Do you identify the nature of the conflict at the meeting? So what you'll see is, I'm disqualified on this issue. I own property within 1,000 feet, so I'm going to go stand in the closed session room, right? You say that you're disqualified. You give the nature of your disqualification. I own property. I work for the sheriff's department. I have a source of income related to this. I have investments that are related to this. And then you walk out. That's step 3. Leave the room during discussion and voting. Usually you go to the closed session room and then we come get you when the item is done. Any questions? Okay. Like you've seen for the others, we have the consequences slide. What happens? The decision could be invalidated. It could be a misdemeanor. There's sometimes fines, attorney's fees, and embarrassment, right? Nobody wants an FPPC opinion that you shouldn't have participated in the decision. There are special rules for contracts. This is when your city attorney talks about 1090 issues. I'm referring to Government Code Section 1090. This is one of the oldest statutes on the books in the state of California. And it says that you are not allowed, this city as an entity is not allowed to enter into contracts where a member of the council has a financial interest in that contract. So while you may have a financial interest in a zoning decision for something going on down the street and you disqualify yourself, but the city is nevertheless able to still enter into the contract. If you have a financial interest in a contract, disqualification isn't enough. The city can't enter into that contract. So, for example, let's say we had a member of the council who owned an asphalt and paving company, right? The city, even if we went through the public works bidding process and they were the lowest responsible bidder and they had all their paperwork and they were a good deal for the city, right? We would not be able to award the contract to that council member's business, right? In fact, we have some case studies here. Oh, instead of asphalt and paving, I used IT for this one. So the city's in process of upgrading its software systems to improve efficiency and provide better tools for the public and city staff. One of the council members owns a software company that specializes in public agency software solutions. How about that? The software company submits a bid to provide the new software systems to the city. Could the city enter into the contract, even if they were the lowest bidder? I think I just gave you the answer. I'm really sorry. No, we would not be able to do that. This one's better. The city operates a local airport, and city staff enter into leases for hangar space to any member of the public that requests it at published rates. May a council member who owns a plane lease a hangar from the city? I see a no. But I'm not so sure. And you? She's kind of maybe no. You know, what are you thinking? Yes or no? It's harder, right? Yeah, so I just told you you can't enter into a contract, right? And then I just gave you an example where maybe you can. That's why the lawyers make a killing with this stuff, okay? So in this case, I've written this example. It's a very narrow exception, okay? And that is when the city is entering into the contract. It is open to the public generally. Any member of the public can enter into that same contract. And there's no discretion as to the financial side of it. It's at published rates, right? So that is the specific example that came up in the past, and the FPPC blessed that specific scenario. There are a few other exceptions that I don't think we're going to go into, but just think to yourself, no contracts with the city unless we have an exception. I think I saw a hand raised.
So in that scenario, what's your advice to the member?
My advice to the member was, let's ask the FPPC if it's okay, if it's not urgent. It wasn't urgent. The lease was expiring on their previous hangar, I think 3 months away. So we were able to get written advice. The FPPC said, yeah, it's fine.
Wouldn't the perception be an issue?
I don't think so, because in this case, again, the rates are published rates. So this is, any member of the public can come in and make an application. The lease is a form. The amounts, how much we're renting it out, are a form. It wasn't a public perception issue in that case. Now, if the city was negotiating the rates, and not even the council, maybe it was the city manager or a member of staff, then I think you have, one, I think you get outside the exception here. But two, I think you start having the perception issue of, well, I mean, they probably gave the council member a deal, right? There'd certainly be the perception that had occurred. Even if you could whip up every rate that you have and show, no, it's above average, right? I think that then you get into the public perception issues, yeah. But look, it should give you pause. It gave 3 of you pause. I saw 3 people going, I don't know. So if it gave you pause, that might be in a situation where the law permits it, but I'm still not going to do it as a council person, right? And that goes back to the operating at a higher level than even I'm recommending. At the same time, if you own a plane and it's the only airport within 20 miles, right, where else are you going to go? So those are the choices you face.
When those rates come back to the council for approval, would that member then vote on the new rate schedule that includes that lease?
So getting questions from the audience, I'm going to say it onto the mic just in case anyone who's listening. The question from one of our staff members, and it was an excellent question, was if a council person is renting the hangar and the rates come back to the council for approval to increase, how should they vote? And so I think in that case, they would be required to disqualify themselves because the rates affect a relatively small segment of the population in the city. But I'm going to give you the counter example, right? One of the things that you are going to be asked to do is approve solid waste rates, right? That's a utility that the city controls. The city controls the maximum permitted solid waste rates. You are literally voting for how much your trash bill is going to be. And if you're like me, you want it to stay as low as possible, right? However, there's an exception, like we said, for affects the public generally. Everyone in the city has to get solid waste service at the maximum permitted rates that are approved by the city council. So you have that exception. You can still participate in that even though it directly affects your own finances. So I think that gives the 2 different examples. Any questions? Oh, more, yes. Gives me time to drink water, so please.
Well, I think that was a good question, Joe. I think this is one of them gray areas. Say you use the analogy of the playground, public park. That's a different ballgame. This is a financial agreement. And I think this is a gray area that we should be cautioned by our city attorney. Just don't step into it. I mean, if we're going to be conservative in our advice, this is something that we should, as council members, I'm not advising the council members what to do, but this is that gray area that, once you start stepping into this stuff, this becomes issues later because, as Joe said, okay, what if the rates are, it just continues. It's one step, then it's another step. If you use the analogy of the playground, which is a public park, that's different. This is a financial situation. I would be interested to see what the FPPC would say about this.
They have. So this is based directly on an FPPC opinion.
And they may say it's okay, but is it right?
So the FPPC will never tell you something's okay. What they'll say is it doesn't violate the law. And so that goes back to
There's a difference.
What I talked about earlier, right?
You get where I'm going?
Yeah. So I talked about this earlier, and I said, I'm going to get on my soapbox occasionally, right? I'm training you on what the law is. It's important that we know what the law is and what the law requires. If a council member wants to use that as their lodestar, I'm going to follow the law and only the law. There's nothing legally preventing a council member from doing that. However, I've seen public officials who operate in that manner, and oftentimes there's public scrutiny and outcry that accompanies it, right? So if you're asking what your city attorney should advise you, your city attorney is going to advise you what the law requires. And then I'll probably add something to the end of, okay, but even though the law requires it, think about these things. Fundamentally, my role is to advise you on the law. So in this case, specifically this case, right, what I would tell you is that the FPPC has given advice on this matter, and they have determined that this is permissible. Now, it's going to be incumbent upon you and your colleagues, right, to say, okay, even if something is legally permissible, is it still the right thing to do as a public official? And I think that that's an important question to ask for every single one of these scenarios. And if this particular scenario is too close to the line for you, that's great, right? Don't lease the hangar space. But I think that you're going to, as a council member, have to wrestle with the competing values of participating in decisions, because that's what you were elected to do. You were elected to make the tough calls and participate in the decisions. And you're going to have to wrestle with that versus how close to this line am I willing to go? For myself, my own personal ethics, and also for the public perception of me fulfilling my duties.
You actually said it in your, when you were talking earlier, you said we're held to a higher standard. That's one of them moments, in my viewpoint. So as we move forward, these are the things you have to consider, because in time, I've seen these things over the years, is that it's okay to do it, but is it the right thing to do?
It's legal to do
because
it.
or it's legal, not okay.
Yeah.
It's legal to do it, but that's a gray area. And I just wanted to express that.
Absolutely.
You know,
And like I said,
you'll give us advice and we decide as our own person what we want to do.
Yeah.
But these are the kind of things, especially nowadays, as scrutinized as we are as elected leaders, that we have to start setting the standard now, that we are at a higher standard of ethics, of moral, legal behavior. That's a great scenario you put up there for us to chat about it under this training today. So
great.
maybe you meant to do that. I don't know.
So I usually start off with easy examples and then I try to make them harder. And the point is to do this exactly this. This is supposed to be participatory and to get discussion among you and your colleagues. I think striving for a higher standard is great. I know that that's something that the council has really been pushing for with the Sunshine Ordinance and with other initiatives over the last 2 years. And obviously, I think there's still work to go. And so keep these things in mind. And there's going to be a couple more close calls in the presentation. So would love to hear your thoughts on it. So that is disqualification for personal financial interests. Next one is future employment issues. This one's pretty straightforward. No participation in decisions involving future employers. I'll give my own example from once upon a time when I was a public official. I was an in-house deputy city attorney for a city here in the Inland Empire. About in 2018, I decided that I was going to be going out into private practice, joining a private firm. I applied at several different firms. One of the firms I applied to was a contractor for the city. They were special counsel for the city. One of my duties was to review and approve invoices. As soon as I made the decision to go and begin applying, I asked my supervisor to transfer those duties to another attorney. So I didn't think it'd be ethical to be approving the invoices for a future potential employer, right? Even though personally I think I would have been perfectly capable of doing the job, I think the perception of that and I think the legalities of that would require that I recuse myself. So similar situation here on the council. If you're looking at prospective future employment, you should probably be disqualifying yourself from participation in those decisions. And then lastly, revolving door prohibitions. So this affects the council. It affects anyone sitting here at the staff table with me. Once you leave service with the city, either as an elected official or as an appointee, you cannot represent people for pay in front of the planning commission, in front of the city council for a year after leaving the agency. So I don't get to leave as your city attorney, resign, and then go represent a developer who's coming to bring applications before you. Even if there wasn't a professional code of conduct conflict for me, it would still be prohibited by the government code. So things to think about if and when you leave office about what your future employment prospects are. Key things to remember, we talked about this at the beginning, public interest above your own private interest, and your decisions are not only about the money. Group 2, perks, and these are going to speed up. The disqualification section is the longest one. Democratic equality, means serving the public interests. We don't want special privileges for public officials. One of the stories I like to talk about was in high school, we took a trip to Moscow as part of a student exchange program. Probably can't do that nowadays. Hopefully, relations get back to the point where you can. And one of the things that was pointed out to us was the incredibly large center lanes through downtown Moscow. It isn't like the turning lanes we have. It was a straight 2-lane center lane, and historically those were used by the high-level political officials to avoid traffic as they were driving through the city. Normal folks were not able to use those lanes. They were only able to be used by political officials and government officials. That, I think, is directly contrary to the idea of a citizen statesman that we have here in the United States, which is we are a representative republic. We take members of our community, we elect them for fixed terms. They are not professional bureaucrats. The professional bureaucrats are sitting down here at the staff table. And the expectation is that, again, you'll be putting the public's interest above your own personal interest. You will be not obtaining financial gain through your service to the city. 3 areas: compensation, use of public resources, and gifts. Use of public resources is the one we'll spend the most time on. Compensation, limited by law. The city has an ordinance on the books that sets what the city council's compensation is. There's a maximum set by the state. It's relatively low, all things considered, for the amount of work and time that is spent being a city council member. No honoraria rule. We talk, one of the things that you'll see oftentimes is someone enters Congress and this is their net worth. Someone leaves Congress and this is their net worth, and here's how much they were making every year, and it doesn't quite add up correctly. And the higher up in the federal government you go, the bigger that spread gets. Things like speaking fees, aka honoraria, are one of the reasons for that. So we're not permitted to get honoraria here at the local city council level. Any questions about that? Okay. Use of public resources. This is, again, I think the one that gets the most attention. Personal use of public resources, and that is defined very broadly, and we'll kind of go into what that definition here is in a second, is prohibited. Political use of public resources is very prohibited. So we'll talk about personal use, which is, I think, mildly offensive to the public interest, and then we'll get to political use of public resources, which is very offensive. Public resources. So pens, paper, the copier, very obvious things, right? Staff time, office space are also considered public resources. And so I want to make sure it's not one of my examples. Let's go to the examples, and then I'll give you a couple other ones that I've dealt with that kind of illustrate these distinctions. And again, these are all things that have actually happened. A city planner, this is for a relatively small city that didn't have full-time planning work, so they were contract working part-time, started a small consulting business on the side. Instead of renting office space for their business, they decided to use their public office as a meeting place for their clients, essentially operating their private business out of their public office. You guys see the problem with that? That, again, start off easy, right? If you are talking about, even though we're not talking about stationary, we're talking about office space that was already paid for and provided, there's no hard cost to the city because of this. Nevertheless, I saw all of you, without exception, say, no, you can't do this. Like it's sort of a vitriol reaction to this. Does anyone want to try to articulate what the problem that you feel is with this? It didn't cost the city any money. Okay, so it could be a interfering with the business of the agency. I think it's a really good one.
I think it also blurs the lines. So once you do that, then you start doing other things, and you start using those other resources. You start using the other time. So
Slippery slope.
You would just start expanding into areas, and all of a sudden now it's flagrant.
Okay.
And you're using taxpayer-funded facility for a personal business.
Hit the nail on the head. So I think when we're looking at what was the disciplinary finding on this particular scenario, the first thing was, it doesn't matter if it costs the city any extra. The taxpayers provided that facility for the public's business. They did not provide it for your own personal business, right? And so that's just, I put this one to illustrate that. Sometimes people are like, well, it's no harm, right? Like, it was already there. The fact of the matter is what was the purpose? Who paid for it and why did they pay for it? The public paid for it to do the public's business. They didn't pay for it to use your own private business. Additionally, they found in this particular case that there was using the indicia, the feeling of the governmental office, right? Which gave an inappropriate level of authority to this private business that wasn't right. So, it'd be like wearing your sheriff's uniform when you're off duty for your own personal advantage, something like that. Doing it out of the government office was inappropriate. Case study 2. A council member is running for a re-election and decides to have a public employee help with their campaign during work hours. They make campaign calls, print and distribute flyers, maintain the campaign website, all while on the clock for their public position. What do we think about that? Ridiculous, right? The public is paying that salary, is paying for that equipment, and using it for political purposes to run a campaign clearly violates the law. They get a little harder. A city employee is planning a large family event and decides to use the city's copy machine and paper supplies to print invitations and other materials for the event. They also borrow AV equipment from the city to use. What do you think? No, can't do it, right? So that's using city supplies. Some people say, well, if they bring in their own paper, is it different? Not really, because the fact is, most of our copiers, we pay per copy for maintenance and toner charges. Borrowing the AV equipment, it was used and brought back. It didn't cost the city any money, but we already kind of discussed that distinction. Let me give you a more difficult one. So these were all kind of easy. The full-time mayor, elected at large mayor, full-time position, has to wear suits to go to ceremonial events. And he has his assistant that is paid for and provided by the city to take the suits to the dry cleaner to get them dry cleaned. He pays for it. He pays for the dry cleaning, but he has his assistant do it. How do you feel about that? You don't like it? Why don't you like it? It's his uniform.
This goes back a long ways, but being a woman, when women started out in business, they did all that kind of stuff, for the boss. And disrespectful, I think, in the way. He can
Okay.
drop off his suits at the cleaner is on the way home.
Sure.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
What's in the job description?
Well, that too.
It does not say picking up and dropping off dry cleaning, if that's the question. It does say other assignments as required.
But that's not really required, is it?
Well, do we want our mayor showing up sloppily dressed?
No, but the mayor needs to be responsible enough for himself.
So this, Councilmember Miller was looking for more gray line scenarios to spark discussion. Obviously, these examples are too easy for the council. You're seeing right through them. So I'm giving you something a little more difficult. This was a challenge. This was a challenge. This was at a jurisdiction that provided dry cleaning services to public safety personnel for their dress uniforms. See,
That's probably contracted.
And the mayor said, "Well, this is my uniform. I don't wear this in my daily life. I wear it because people expect the mayor to show up, dress smart, in a suit." Ultimately, the city decided it was inappropriate. It's an inappropriate use of staff time. Like you said, you ran for mayor. You knew that the mayor needed to be dressed in a suit. Suits are not business uniforms. There is a distinction there. The IRS has made that distinction. The state of California has made that distinction. And so if you need it dry cleaned, then you can drop it off on your way to work, mayor. So that was a a little more of a gray area one. But he specifically called out the chief of police who was getting his uniform cleaned by the city. And you were right. That was subject to not an MOU, it's to an employment agreement that incorporated the benefits that were provided to the police command unit. Anyone else? Fascinating, right? All right, moving on. Anyone have questions about use of public resources? Would you like a short break? Can we take a few-minute recess, Mayor? Okay.
I'll get used to this. We'll take a recess. It's 3:03. We'll come back at 3:08. Well, I said 3:08.
Oh, sorry,
And my
Mayor.
computer, okay, now
It's
it
your
says
meeting,
3:08.
Mayor.
All right, we can re-adjourn now. It's time, it's 3:08.
Okay. Reimbursement, it's the public's money, so it's actually the state's reimbursement statute under AB 1234 that mandated this training. So the city's required to have an expense reimbursement policy. You should have received a copy from the city clerk as part of your welcome packet. If you haven't, I suggest you get a copy of it. But essentially what we're looking at when we're looking at a reimbursement is it should be ordinary and regular expenses incurred by you in the performance of your city council duties, right? So what you will find is that if you are going to a conference, you are probably not going to be staying in a 5-star resort. You will probably be staying in a mid-tier 3.5 star hotel room. You will be given the federal GSA per diem rates for your food. You will not be reimbursed if you purchase alcohol for your dinner. If you are, meeting people and conducting city business, if you have regular and ordinary expenses incurred in that, it likely meets the requirement for reimbursement under the policy. But again, since Councilmember Miller brought this up, I'm gonna come back to it. That may be allowed by the policy, but I've seen many local officials get in trouble by following the letter of the policy and submitting meal after meal after meal, lunch. Every now and then, you may get a citizen, you may get a local newspaper who puts in a public record request for your expense reimbursements, and they are public record. And what may seem relatively small and trivial can sometimes spiral into a significant public discussion. So this is another instance where the policy may allow it, the law may allow it, but it may be better to err on the side of picking up your own lunch when you go out. Political use of public resources by individuals or the agency itself, supportive ballot measures. So you will note that the city, when we had Measure S on the ballot, did not engage in express advocacy. In fact, the city is prohibited from doing so. The city is permitted to educate members of the public on what is on the ballot before them, what are the potential effects of supporting it or not supporting it. But you'll notice that you don't have city money going towards yes on S or no on S signs. That kind of activity used to occur in the state of California and no longer does. So every expenditure, I think almost every expenditure of city funds was thoroughly vetted by the city and the legal team to ensure we were in compliance with the FPPC regulations and with the spirit of those regulations on that.
Mr. Graham, I don't know if it falls under this, but us as city council members, if we wanted to put out an information flyer, for example, on the blackouts, and to give information to our residents, is there a dollar number or amount that we could use to put it out as an information flyer? It's not a political. What are the rules on that? I thought you could do something.
So this goes to mass mailing restrictions. Whenever we are putting out a mass mailing, so these are flyers, pamphlets, what have you, there are restrictions on the number of people that it can be sent to. And if it goes above that number, then there are restrictions on including the name, photograph, and other identifying information of council members. And the intent is you don't want to use what is called franking privileges or the mailing privileges of the city to essentially create pseudo campaign mailers going out to city residents. And so if the city were to put out a flyer, so coming from the city government, informational, here's what's going on with public safety power shutoffs, it's regulated by the CPUC, it's done by Edison, the city honestly doesn't have a role in deciding what gets turned off, what doesn't. Here's how it affects city operations. Here's how it's going to affect you. Here's how you can prepare. That is all fine. Now, if it says, sincerely, Councilmember Miller, with a picture of Councilmember Miller on it, then we go into the mass mailing prohibitions. And we'd have to be very careful about that kind of thing. Where you start getting into sort of the grayer areas is, come to a town hall meeting with the council member, meet and greet with the council member, right? We can put that information out, and having town halls, having meet and greets is expected part of the performance of your duties. But one of the things I caution council members on is to not only engage in town halls during campaign season, right? Because then what it looks like is campaigning activity disguised as performing your official duties. If you are regularly engaging in that activity throughout your entire term, then it's appropriate. Just like if the city's regularly engaging in communications. You don't want to speed that up or cause an excess during campaign season. It just looks inappropriate, even if maybe it's not legally inappropriate.
The reason, and I'm new at this, Steve. For example, from the state representatives, we get different flyers all the time of a different subject matter. Mm-hmm. But it's a mailer, but it's a different subject every time. Right. So if we were trying to communicate with our district, for example, on an emerging issue that we wanted to talk about, short of a town hall or something, we couldn't. You're saying there'd be a limit on the number of mailers you could do. Just keep your picture off it, or explain what you're allowed to do. That's ethical, legal, and moral to communicate to your constituents.
So if the council wanted to set up a budget, a communications budget, where council members could send out regular informational mailers to the residents, that's something that could be set up within the confines of the law. But we would have to restrict the inclusion of photographs and of the names and signatures of council members to fall within those regulations. Does that make sense?
Yes, it perfect sense. Do you know of anybody that does that in cities around us?
Not anymore.
Not anymore.
It used to be pretty consistent, like maybe 20 years ago and earlier.
Okay.
I think now most public officials utilize social media.
Okay.
The scope is much bigger. The audience is much bigger. It also doesn't run afoul of any of these regulations. You can put together that distribution process of Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. You can get a video put together, get it pushed out, doesn't fall within these regulations, and actually meets the needs of the community generally much faster. And then if you want to have an informational pamphlet, you can attach it as an attachment to that. And 9 times out of 10, that's going to be seen and read by much more people. Yep. And be cheaper.
Yes, and what about if you wanted to do a survey in your district on something? Could that be done through the city?
So I think it would depend on the nature of the survey, right? Yes, lawyer answer, depends.
Yeah.
If we're talking about, looking for public sentiment on matters of public policy, I think there's absolutely a way we could set that up. Especially if we're doing an electronic survey that doesn't result in any significant mailings, right, by the city. In fact, cities regularly do surveys to measure public sentiment. If you're talking about a scientific survey, you're going to need to get the city council likely to appropriate money because those can be rather expensive.
Yeah.
Especially the more people you want to survey. If you're just looking at putting together a Survey Monkey, which is one example of an organization that does it, that would allow you to do a free survey and you put it out through your social media like, hey, like I'm interested in people's feedback on this issue. That's perfectly permissible. The only thing I would advise you is that it's not going to be scientific. So you're going to probably get a pretty strong negative response bias. Just be prepared for that. People are willing to click links for something they don't like more than they're willing to click things for things that they
Right.
are indifferent to or support.
Okay, thank you.
Another question. So I think the Councilman Miller's question, the state legislature has prescribed mailings that all legislators have obviously stick their, essentially their logo on. And they get through the mailing restrictions because it has a limited number of their name and having the name of the, in the letterhead is one of the ways to get around it. So you can have the name printed once or at least once in the letterhead. Can you speak more to that?
Joe was bringing up that the legislature gets around the rules that they've imposed on all of you through clever use of letterhead, including their names on the letterhead. And like I said, if there was a desire to get out mailings, we would need an appropriation from the council to pay for it, and you could put together a mailer that would meet those requirements, like we're mentioning here. But like I said, it's generally gone out of favor. It's not utilized in any of the agencies that I work for anymore. It used to be very common. So we have 40 minutes left. I'm going to kick the afterburners on for the last few of these so we can get to the Brown Act section, if that's okay. Gifts don't always have bows. We're talking about gifts now. Meals, food, drink, entertainment, certain kinds of travel. There's a picture of a train there for a very specific reason. We'll get to it. Gifts. You have to report gifts of $50 and over. These are reported on one of your FPPC forms that you fill out. And you are limited, the new limits are $630 per year in total aggregate gifts. Exceptions for certain kind of travel, informational materials. It may also be per source, not total. And there's exceptions to this. So this is primarily going to be gifts received from people that you are interacting with in your capacity as a council member. If you are talking about, I've had council members get married, right? And they invite their friends and close family to their wedding, and their uncle from Ohio wants to give them $1,000 gift. There's an exception for that. Okay, so just be aware. Still have to report it. Still have to report it, but there's an exception for it. The city manager actually is well aware of these rules. However, I want you to keep in mind that when you're going to start receiving people, some of it will be perfectly innocent, some of it may not be, but the intent is to make sure you are aware that when you are receiving gifts now in your capacity as a public official, the expectation is that most of those will need to be disclosed. And you'll notice this is why the city attorney accepts no gifts, although we did have a very wonderful holiday season recently. You can also have gifts that are given to the agency. So you'll oftentimes see contractors will bring in chocolates, candies, cookies, and they make them available to the city at large. So this is not one of those rules that is completely cut and dry. I just want you thinking, if someone is giving me something and I'm not having an exchange of value with them, I need to consider whether I need to report that on my FPPC forms. The FPPC has really good guidance on this that goes into all the exceptions in detail, and I'm always happy to talk to you about it specifically. There is a special rule. You are not allowed to take free rides on railroads. So this is an incredibly specific rule. It's in the California Constitution. At one point in time, the railroad was the big corporate entity in the state of California. And most people who lived in California were farmers or other business people who the use of the railroad was central to their livelihood. Having the ability to use the railroad for free was a massive benefit that could be received. And the railroads use that to great effect to control local government. So there is a prohibition on free transportation. If you take a free ride on a railroad, you are potentially immediately vacating your office and disqualified from holding public office. So once upon a time, there was a young deputy city attorney in the city of San Bernardino whose public officials were invited to train days where they were to take a free ride on a steam locomotive, who showed up and demanded that the city pay fair market value for those tickets. So it's a weird rule. It's one that I want you to be aware of. We don't have a railroad that we have to worry about here, but something to think about. Transparency laws, and we're going to go through these pretty quickly because we actually have a separate presentation for it. The major things to know is it's the public's business, and the public trusts the process that it can see, right? Telling people trust us where the government doesn't go all that far. Trust us where the government, and here's all the documents so you can look at it yourself, tends to get you a lot further. Financial disclosure, charitable fundraising, we're going to go through those pretty quickly. Brown Act, we have a separate presentation on, and then the Public Records Act. So I've talked about Form 700s and other FPPC forms. So there are a multitude of forms that you are required to fill out now as public officials. They include your income, where you own property, if you're receiving gifts, if you're directing charitable fundraising, if you're receiving tickets to events through the city. These are just examples of the kind of forms that you're required to fill out. And all the city's forms can be found online at Yucaipa.gov.
Are you going to talk about ticket policy? Is that part of this?
No.
Okay.
Would you like to talk about the ticket policy,
Yeah.
Mr. City Manager?
So this has been a big issue that's come up in the past. There are a lot of events that go on in the community here, and some of them are put on by the city, and some are put on by external entities. And so we do have an adopted ticket policy here in the city that pertains to events put on by third parties. So let's take the rodeo as an example. The rodeo is not technically a city event. That's put on by a separate group, they're the equestrian group. They give the city a block of tickets. They give those tickets to the city, and per the city's ticket policy, the city can distribute those to you and to a certain number of guests. But if the rodeo, if that third-party group gave the tickets directly to you, those would have to be reported as gifts, on your 700 form. So if it's a city event, it's different. If it's a city event, then we have more flexibility, however many tickets you need, et cetera. So you want to say something on that?
That's great. It's expected as public officials that you will attend a great number of events. You are going to be constantly invited. The city has a robust ticket policy that we've recently reviewed. And the intent of that policy, which I recommend if you haven't reviewed, have a look at, is to ensure that you are able to fulfill your obligations by appearing at these public events while not running afoul of the FPPC regulations. Charitable fundraising, the only thing I will say on this is there's an obligation to disclose $5,000 or more in directed charitable fundraising. So this was a way that some public officials were attempting to skirt the disclosures on income or disclosures on gift giving. They would say, no, don't give it to me, but I have this charity that I really appreciate that does really good work in our community. And then lo and behold, the public official's spouse works for the nonprofit. Okay? All right. So careful with directing people to give money to charity. We'll talk about the Brown Act here in a minute. Public Records Act. The short version is any record of the city, and that doesn't just mean paper. That means electronic records as well. Is the default rule is subject to public disclosure. There are exceptions, and there are a great many exceptions, and there are a great many interpretations of those exceptions. The Public Records Act is primarily based on the Federal Freedom of Information Act, but it does have its own California quirks. I would just recommend that you consider anything that you put in writing, in a text, in an email, in hard copy, consider that may at some point be subject to public disclosure. If you get an email from me, you may find that I write more formally than I perhaps speak. And that is after years and years of having my emails, not necessarily publicly disclosed as an attorney, but disclosed to other people within an organization who maybe weren't the intended recipient. Happens to you once or twice, you start to become, I think, very formal in your written and maybe even your spoken communication. So something to think about is any text you send, any email you send, think about how would this look if it was disclosed publicly? Because one day it might be. Okay. Public Records Act requests come into the city clerk. She is responsible for processing them, locating and obtaining the records. Our office sometimes is asked to assist on reviewing and redacting the records. Fortunately, Public Safety, our police agency, has their own process for responding to records requests there. Police departments generate a significant amount of records requests. Ours here tend to focus almost exclusively on code enforcement and building permitting issues. Every now and then we do get politically related ones, but that hasn't been the norm. Fair process laws. So the short version here, and again, we're trying to chug along so we get a decent amount of time on the Brown Act presentation. The important principle here is to be fair when you're making decisions. Sometimes you're going to have to be more fair than other times. What does that mean? Due process requirements sometimes come into play. You may hear that we're going to have a public hearing, right? A public hearing can mean many things. But if it's a public hearing and it's about a planning or zoning matter, and a few other select ones, but we'll focus on planning and zoning for the current moment, then we're oftentimes going to be in what's called a quasi-judicial hearing. Quasi means sort of, and judicial means like a judge. So in those cases, we are not passing a law. So oftentimes you're doing budget actions, or you're enacting a regulation or an ordinance. You are passing laws. Sometimes you as a council have to apply a law that already exists to an individual or an applicant. So this may be an appeal of a conditional use permit. Maybe someone asked for a conditional use permit to operate a certain type of business to the Planning Commission. And the Planning Commission said, nope, we're not going to approve it. And so the applicant has appealed it to you. In that case, you are going to have a heightened standard of fairness that you need to apply under due process principles. That means that the applicant is entitled to an impartial decision maker, just like a judge, right? So unlike other legislative acts where you are perfectly free to have an opinion, state your opinion, tell everyone your opinion, when it comes to a quasi-judicial hearing, you shouldn't have made a public statement as to your position before hearing all the evidence. If you have, it may require that you disqualify yourself. That's the biggest one. The other one under our rules of conduct is ex parte communications. So when we have a quasi-judicial hearing, when we have a planning matter, you're not prohibited from talking with the applicant, members of the public, anyone, frankly, about that matter, but you are required to disclose it before the hearing starts. And the reason for that is that we want the public, the applicant, and other people who have an interest, they need to know what information you have in your head. Ex parte communications can include just a verbal conversation. They can include information that was sent to you. You need to disclose the nature, the general nature of that, and someone may ask for a copy of it, right? Going back to the public records discussion we had earlier. One of the other things I think you should disclose on the record before a planning item, if you've traveled to the physical location. So this is something I like to do, but I'm not up on the dais, right? If we have a significant planning discussion for a large development, Serrano Estates, Wine Country Specific Plan, Freeway Corridor Specific Plan, these are three relatively significant zoning decisions that this city has made. I, on my own, went to each one of those locations personally. I wanted to see it because I think that so much of when we're talking about the zoning context, it's really about the character of the neighborhood and whether it fits in. And oftentimes I think you can only really do that by being there and looking at it. But that's information that you would have that maybe others on the dais don't have. And so my recommendation would be that you disclose that. On this day, I traveled to the location and I looked around, or maybe I got a tour, right? Okay.
So not necessarily on planning, but for instance, like if there was an issue that you've talked to several people about and done kind of your own personal little survey?
Sure.
I mean, is that something that you would disclose?
So if it's a quasi judicial hearing, so again, going back to that planning, so what we're saying is if we are applying a law that exists to an individual, then yes. But if it's a legislative act, if it's, let's say the freeway corridor specific plan, I'm just
Okay.
gonna use a specific example, right?
Yeah.
That's a legislative act. Wine Country specific plan, that's a legislative act, right? No project is being approved by that specific plan, but you're changing the law under which future projects will be approved. In that case, you're free to talk to whoever you want. You don't have to disclose it, and you don't have to be fair. You can, let me rephrase. You should be fair, but you don't have to keep your opinion to yourself. You could perfectly say like, yeah, you know, this future plan is coming forward. This ordinance is coming forward, and I think I'm going to support it. Or there's no way I could support it. But I would say be very careful with that. Right? This is again one of those tools. If you get it wrong, you may end up having to recuse yourself. I can think of a couple examples in this city where, you know, I've gotten a call from a council person or a planning commissioner and said, hey, you know, this is what's coming forward. You know, people are wanting to talk to me. You know, can I do that? Right? And the answer is usually yes, but you will have to disclose, or yes, and you won't have to disclose. Okay? Fair process laws, we talked about conflicting loyalties, incompatible offices. So this happened to Councilmember Miller. Councilmember Miller was a member of another jurisdiction that overlaps with the city of Yucaipa, and upon his appointment, he resigned from that position. Same thing happened to me. I was an attorney for a local agency that had concurrent jurisdiction over the city of Yucaipa, and when I accepted this appointment, I resigned from the other. So it doesn't mean that there's an actual conflict of loyalty. I think we all are trying to row in the same direction for the city of Yucaipa, but it does mean that when you have a school district, a city, a water district, you have these different agencies, some of which, like the city, have a very general, broad mandate and purpose, and some of which, like a special district, have a very specific purpose that they have been empowered by state law to focus on. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're all going to think that we're not all going to have the same exact solution to a problem, right? And so they want to make sure that we have those separations built in, which means we can't be working for both agencies. Competitive bidding requirements, you'll see this is primarily driven by staff, but there are certain types of requirements under our purchasing code and under state law that we're required to put out to bid. We have to award it maybe to the lowest bidder. Sometimes if it's for another type of service, we can go based on the qualifications experience, and there are other types of contracts you're not required to do an RFP at all. Focus on the merits of the decision and make sure that we have fair decision-making processes. Here's the part where I get on the soapbox again, but I'm again try to go quickly here so we can get to the Brown Act presentation. You want to apply your values. We talked about those earlier. Be truthful with fellow officials, the public, and others. You know, I have found that this honestly is one of those things that if you just tell it straight all the time and you get a reputation for telling it straight all the time, it makes your life a lot easier. And people respect you for it, even when they perhaps disagree with your position. Sometimes you're going to have two competing values, right? So perhaps supporters want you to do something that you don't think is in the best interest of the public, right? So loyalty versus responsibility, right? And you're going to have to weigh these things and decide what is in the public's interest and what's the best path forward. These are some questions. You guys should have access to the slides. I'm not going to belabor the point, but generally speaking, I'm encouraging you to apply that newspaper front page test when making decisions. Operational culture, we talked about this as well. This starts at the top. The city council makes it very clear that, like Councilmember Miller said, operating at a higher level than the minimum requirements is important. Then that message gets translated to staff as well, right? And the expectation is that we follow suit and don't just follow the letter of the law, we go a step above. You want to create that culture of ethics. Determine what your boundaries are before a difficult situation. I talked about this earlier, where we've talked about some of these different situations. I think it's important to think about these things in advance. I think if you think about them in advance, if and when you're ever presented with one of these scenarios, you will react instinctively, you will know how to act, you won't have to think about it, and you will save yourself a lot of heartache. Don't go for just the minimum requirements here, try to go above. Questions before we go to the Brown Act? Not yet. Okay, can we get the second presentation? There we go, we're good. Sorry, I thought for a second that I had bored our staff. All right, so Brown Act training. This one, it goes into a little bit more depth because I think this is the one that councils deal with the most. And I think we get a lot of questions from the public. We're going to talk about the background and history. We're going to talk about what is a meeting, as well as some other definitions. We're going to talk about agendas and how they're processed and what information they have to have. We're going to go into closed sessions. I found that this, when we did have members of the public who attended the last training, they were very interested in closed sessions. I think there's sort of an intrigue about what goes on in closed sessions. It's much less interesting, as you all know, than most people think. And then we talk about enforcement, what happens when the Brown Act is not followed. Same disclaimer as before. This isn't legal advice. This is a general topic overview. The Brown Act. So the Brown Act is a law that was passed in the state of California to enhance transparency in the governmental decision-making process. Up till that point, they had city council meetings, but oftentimes the city council meetings were almost ceremonial. People discussed and politicked well beforehand, and then when it came time to a vote, the decision had almost already been made. You see this kind of behavior in legislative bodies to this day. It isn't necessarily wrong, but I think they wanted to see more transparency at the local level. I put this quote in, and this is actually verbatim from the government code. I hate it when people read slides, but I'm going to read this one. I'm going to use my sunglasses to do it. Excuse me. The people of this state do not yield their sovereignty to the agencies which serve them. The people in delegating authority do not give their public servants the right to decide what is good for them people to know and what is not good for them to know. I think that's important, and thank you, Mr. City Manager, for that. Because it really speaks to, if we're following what the purpose and intent of the Brown Act is, I think you're rarely going to come into trouble with any of the specific provisions. The intent of the Brown Act is for the public to, one, know what decisions are going to be made by the city council, right? That's the purpose of the agenda. What are they going to talk about? I called it the TV guide for city council meetings until I got some blank stares from some of the younger staff at one point. And so now I just call it the schedule for what we're going to be having at city council. And fundamentally, it gives the public the ability to know, like, am I going to give up time on my Monday night to go down to a city council meeting? Well, generally, if there's something I care about, yes. But if there's not anything I care about, then no. How do I make that decision? I look at the agenda. Legislative bodies of a public agency here, that's the city council. So if you look through the Brown Act, it talks about legislative bodies or the body. Here, that's the city council, the planning commission, any standing subcommittee of the city council, and any other citizen advisory committee that the city council has established and made the Brown Act applicable to. So what's a meeting? A meeting occurs when a majority of the members of a legislative body are present at the same time, in the same place. And I put this specific quote in here because this is one of the areas of the Brown Act that they changed recently. And when I say recently, I mean since I started my career, which is getting further and further into the past. To hear, discuss, or deliberate the business of the council. It used to say to form consensus, discuss, or deliberate. They took form consensus and they replaced it with hear, because what cities and other agencies were doing was having briefing sessions with the city council, which was closed to the public, where you would all sit there and be very quiet, and we would give you all of the information, and we would try to read your faces and decide sort of if we needed to make changes. And what they decided was, that's a bad practice. We want the process to be as public as possible. So no more briefing sessions. They used to call them maybe study sessions. Those don't occur anymore. The Brown Act has trouble keeping up with technology. And so we'll talk about some of those things now. When I started working in municipal law, they had just added fax machines and emails to the Brown Act. The fax machine was invented in the 1800s, and they didn't get to this until the mid-2010s. Email was added, and you got to kind of, when you're looking at how the Brown Act has been interpreted by the courts, they interpret this relatively broadly. So when they say at the same place at the same time, that includes on the same email thread, even if you didn't necessarily all read it or receive it at the same time, okay? I've never, ever found a Brown Act violation that occurred with a fax machine. I have been searching because I love hearing examples like that. There are limited exceptions to meetings, to the definition of meeting. There could be a majority of you present at a conference, for example. Leave California cities being the most obvious example. Trainings, workshops, community forums. Community forum needs to be a forum put on by another entity, not us, right? So if the city has a town hall meeting and a majority of the council shows up, that would be an improper meeting of the city council. Other meetings of other government bodies that have been agendized, so if a majority wanted to go to a board of supervisors meeting, school board meeting, that would be permissible because those agencies are also subject to the Brown Act. And then social or ceremonial occasions. Maybe we put 3 of you on a float next year for the winter parade. Perhaps we have Chamber of Commerce dinner, right? Those kinds of things. This used to include the state of the city until the Attorney General gave an opinion that no, the state of the city is a majority of the council, and you're literally talking about the business of local government. And it was kind of hard to argue with their logic once they put it that way. So you will find if we do have future state of the cities that they will be likely agendized city council meetings, or a majority of you may decide not to be present. Those are kind of the 2 options. In my other jurisdictions, they opted to have a agendized public meeting. We did public comment for the state of the city at the preceding city council meeting so that the state of the city could proceed as you normally would expect it to. Prohibited meetings. Telephone, fax machine, there it is. Email, an intermediary, such as staff, or other method to discuss, deliberate, or take action. So serial meetings. Does anyone want to try to explain a serial meeting before I attempt to? Okay. So a serial meeting is where you have a majority of the city council, but they're communicating and they're not all in the same place at the same time. So Councilmember A talks to Councilmember B. 2 people, no problem. But then Councilmember B goes and talks to Councilmember C and says, hey, A is supporting this if you'll support it. Now, 1, 2, 3, a majority of the city council have discussed the action amongst themselves, although not being in the same place. They've done it in serial, hence serial meeting. Does that work? Okay. Acceptable communications. Attorney-client communications, so I am capable of sending you attorney-client memorandums. These are generally only one-way communications. We cannot have a discussion amongst the entire council outside of a notice public meeting in closed session. One-way communications by the city manager is the other type. You may get information pushed out to you. So, recently we've, had some concern about winds, public safety power shutoffs. Maybe you got an email saying, hey, this is what's going on. Those one-way communications are permitted by the Brown Act. And then individual contacts by the member with constituent staffs or a colleague. Colleague has an asterisk next to it. Pick your council buddy. Not for everything, but maybe for a specific item. The council person you're going to talk to about that item. And you 2 can talk to each other to your heart's content. However, 3 of you, either together or in a serial, may not. Generally, I found that council relationships are most effective when maybe you have a topic that you and another council person maybe talk on. Maybe you're members of an ad hoc committee on that topic, or maybe you just both have an interest in it. Generally speaking, you don't want to only talk to one other council member all the time about everything. You want to mix it up a bit. The public. Meetings must be accessible to the public. The public is not required to attend, but they do need to be accessible. That means in a public place, within the jurisdictional boundaries of the city, it must be ADA accessible to members with disabilities. And we cannot require attendees to sign an attendance sheet or even identify themselves as a requirement of attendance. Anonymously observing and criticizing the government is a foundational constitutional principle. So you will see occasionally we will get, I call them First Amendment auditors. They may come to City Hall and videotape. They may come to a city council meeting and attempt to record it. As long as they're not disrupting the business that we're engaging in or the public's business, they're perfectly free to do it. And in fact, not attempting to interfere or get in their way usually leads to a relatively easy interaction. Meetings must involve the public. So there's public comment. Now I want to be really clear. Public comment is just that. It is an opportunity for the public to provide a one-way flow of information, to comment and give you that person's perspective on that issue in a reasonable amount of time, currently set to 3 minutes in the city of Yucaipa. It is not an opportunity for a back and forth debate, dialogue. I highly encourage the council not to talk to members of the public who are in the audience or engage with them if they're shouting things out. In fact, I recommend that the mayor encourage them to follow our rules of procedure and decorum for various reasons. One, it's disruptive to the flow of meeting. There's supposed to be a certain gravitas to a city council meeting. You would never, for example, if you were in court, you would never have people shouting from the gallery while the proceedings were going on. But additionally, in this day and age, these proceedings are oftentimes viewed more by people online than they are viewed in person. If someone is speaking and they're not speaking into a microphone, the people who are observing this cannot hear. They don't know what's going on. They don't know what you're hearing and what you're responding to and maybe what's influencing your decision. So it's important that if anyone is addressing the council and it may influence your decision, that they do so from the podium with the microphone turned on. So you'll notice when we did have a question from someone who was observing the meeting today, tried to repeat the question into the microphone. And so that's the other sort of best practice. We can't prohibit criticism of the agency, not that anyone would try. I think criticism makes us better, especially if it is, constructive. I don't know if anyone has attempted to prevent criticism. And the public is permitted to record and broadcast. We talked about that. So I have another agency right now where we have a member of the public. There's a specific topic that they're very interested in. And every meeting, they come with an iPhone on a tripod and they put it up so that they can observe and have their own live broadcast and recording of those events. As long as they're not blocking anyone or preventing anyone from participating in the meeting, it's perfectly fine. Public must have access to copies of the backup material. So backup material that is distributed to a majority of the council is a public record. Generally speaking, in this agency, we endeavor to get all of that backup material as part of the agenda when the agenda is published. That is not a legal requirement, but nevertheless, we seek to have that level of transparency. Occasionally, you may find a document that is not ready. The document itself is not ready when we publish the agenda. And so you may see an agenda backup description that says will be distributed at the meeting. I can tell you from the city attorney's perspective, that is almost invariably contracts that are on very short timers where they have not been finalized and approved by either council or both parties. We don't ever want to bring something to the city council that isn't capable of being approved that night. So you'll still probably get a staff report that describes the item in general and says that we'll be asking for the council to approve a copy of the contract, which will be provided at the meeting. I can tell you that that's not necessarily how every agency operates. I work for agencies that they don't provide copies of the contracts as part of the backup because they're template contracts for the most part, and they clutter the agenda. They will put something in the staff report that a copy of the contract is available for inspection by emailing the city clerk or by going to the city clerk's office, and they have the full backup. But you'll see that, I can tell you on planning items, those will be the bane of your existence in terms of hundreds of pages of documents that you have to review. Those will be generally placed in the backup because it's very important that we be very clear about what is in the record of that decision and what's not. And one of the ways we do that and make it easy on everybody is just including it in the backup. Well, I should say, making it easy on everyone except for the city council. Sorry. Types of meetings, you'll hear this: regular meetings, special meetings. A regular meeting is the meeting that takes place at the regular time and place, right? So for us, that's the second and fourth Mondays of the month here at City Hall. Sometimes we're gonna have special meetings. Those can occur any other day, any other time. They can occur an hour before a regular meeting. They don't have to occur at City Hall. They could be at the YPAC. They could be anywhere else within the jurisdiction. The primary differences between special meetings and regular meetings: one is the amount of notice that you're required to place the agenda up. For a regular meeting, the agenda has to be up 72 hours in advance, 3 days. For a special meeting, it's 24 hours unless we waive it in emergency circumstances. An emergency meeting is just a special kind of special meeting, extra special meeting, where we have specific circumstances that justify not doing 24 hours notice. The other thing is the public comment. So at a regular meeting, we are required by law to have public comment for everything on the agenda and public comment for everything that's within our jurisdiction and not on the agenda, right? When I say jurisdiction, I don't just mean the boundaries of the city. I also mean the subject matter jurisdiction, the things that the city has control over. So, back when, we had wars in the Middle East, we'd sometimes have public commenters who'd want to come and they'd want to talk about, declaring war on Iraq and their feelings on that. Well, city council doesn't have jurisdiction over the military affairs of the United States of America. It's not within our jurisdiction. I think most city councils might indulge it a little bit. They don't want to tell someone who came down that it's not really something they can work on and they need to stop. But sometimes it gets disruptive. I've had to shut down meetings over similar items in the past. Well, the mayor had to shut it down. I had to give the legal justification for that. Adjourned, if we don't get the business done in the time allotted, or I should say the time that the city council is able and willing to get it done. So sometimes these things go late, and mental acuity and critical thinking start to deteriorate after a certain time. Sometimes city council has to adjourn the meeting to the next day, the next week, and that's perfectly permitted. There's a process for that. Agendas. We talked about this earlier. The purpose of the agenda is to put people on notice about what the city council intends to discuss and take action on. Notice is given by the agenda, posted in a public place on our website, and mailed to those people who have asked for notice. Do we email them? We also email them. So if anyone would like to be added to the email list or added to the mailing list, feel free. I would say the mailing list is a requirement of law, but it also doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense because the agenda is mailed out and then it's placed in the US mail. It's not always going to get to you before the meeting. The email list that the city clerk is doing is not something required by law, but it is something that encourages active participation and transparency. We talked about this: 72 hours for the regular meeting, 24 hours for the special meeting. We can waive that 24-hour advance notice and have 1 hour advance notice to the media in the case of natural disasters, terrorist attacks, work stoppages, crippling activity, and severe health and safety. So emergencies, right? I believe the city clerk has a clerk in a box where she's capable of doing a city council meeting literally on 1 hour's notice if we need to get one together. Non-agenda items. Sometimes things come up after we post the agenda, things that need to be discussed and decided. This is thankfully very rare because staff spends a lot of time in advance making sure that things that need to come before the council are placed on an agenda with enough time that they can be decided. But sometimes we're going to be having a meeting and an emergency situation may develop. And so if there is a need to place something on the agenda, you will be asked to vote by a 2/3 vote. Here that means 4 votes in favor, that there's an immediate need to take action and that need came to the attention of the city subsequent to the agenda being posted. So this is a way to add something to the agenda. This should be rare, right? Because again, the purpose of the agenda was to let all the folks know whether we're going to be talking about something that they were interested in and wanted to comment on. And if we're adding things at the meeting to the agenda, it makes it a little challenging for those folks. So usually, these are gonna be under pretty extreme circumstances. I don't think we've actually done it. Is it okay if I take a picture of it? Yeah, and I think the city clerk can also send you and any member who's interested in a full copy of these presentations, a copy as well. Including any members of the public who are present or who are watching on the stream. Going back to public comments. So sometimes, like I said, we're gonna have comments that are not on the agenda, and there's going to be a desire to respond, right? You're gonna wanna educate people. They're gonna come in and they're gonna have a concern. It's not on the agenda though, right? So no other members of the public didn't know that that was gonna be discussed or decided or acted upon. So there are limits on the city's ability to respond to non-agenda items that are brought up from the public. So you may briefly respond. Generally, that's going to be staff. Generally, the mayor will say, city manager, can you briefly talk about that issue just to make sure that we all are operating on the same page, and then can you work with the speaker to resolve it? You can also direct staff to put it on a future agenda. That way, every member of the public knows that this topic is going to be discussed and can come and participate. Any questions? Okay. Members may also make brief announcements and report on their activities. We actually just put that on the agenda. We try to put things on the agenda that happen regularly, including one thing you'll see on our agenda is disclosure of conflicts of interest. Requirements of the agenda. It must contain a brief description of every item to be discussed. It should be clear enough to be understood by members of the public, and it should include a time for public comment. Now, those first two rules are followed almost all the time, except when it's a planning item. You'll notice that the planning item descriptions are very long. They have a lot of legalese in them, and the reason for that is despite the fact that the legislature says descriptions should be brief and easy for members of the public to understand, my profession has spent the last 60 years litigating what exactly that means, and most of the litigation has occurred related to planning applications. That's where a lot of the monies and interests are when it comes to city council decisions. And so there are so many decisions on how exactly you need to, what information you need to include. You know, now we have to include CEQA determinations in the agenda discussion or the agenda description. So the descriptions for planning items are now incredibly long, very complicated. They include a lot of information. And so I just want to be really clear when I tell you brief and easy to understand, that's aspirational. But we still have to comply with the legal requirements, especially for those planning and zoning items. Closed sessions, and I've got just a few more minutes here, so I'm going to make it pretty quick. The default is that we have all of our discussions and decision-making in public. However, there are instances where the public interest outweighs that transparency. Those include lawsuits, they include public employment situations, and they may include others. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. I'm not going to go through the slides. Settlement discussions. If the city is considering settling a lawsuit, oftentimes they are going to give direction to the city attorney, we're willing to settle for any amount up to X number of dollars. If we did that publicly, the plaintiff's attorney can watch exactly how much money you are willing to settle for. The plaintiff's attorney can listen to me give you my objective legal analysis, which may talk about the weaknesses of the city's position in addition to its strengths. That one does a lot of homework for the other side, two can be used against us, and three, why would they settle for any number less than the maximum that you authorized, right? It's not in the public's interest to have those discussions available to the people we are negotiating with. Same thing on real estate negotiations. One of the things that we're allowed to talk about in closed session is the price that the city council is willing to pay to acquire property, or the price that it's willing to take to sell property. If we did that in public, the other party would know. It'd be like trying to buy a house and the other side's realtor is sitting on the call with you, right? You'd never get a good deal. And then the last one is public employment. So oftentimes there's concern, well, you're going to be interviewing for this position. Why don't you interview in public? Well, oftentimes, an individual currently has a position, and if it was revealed that they were applying elsewhere, that may put their current position in jeopardy. And if you want to interview multiple people, someone's not going to get it. So you will find that confidentiality in public employment, not just appointment, but dismissal and evaluations are all confidential, and they all have good reasons for it. So those are the big examples. Litigation, employment, negotiations for land deals. The Brown Act has fill-in-the-blank language for agenda preparation, so we follow that here. Litigation, we talked about. Public employment, we talked about. Confidentiality, the Brown Act prohibits the disclosure of confidential information discussed in closed session. It's actually a misdemeanor to reveal that information. Enforcement, so the Brown Act has a cure process. So if any member of the public or the district attorney's office feels that the city has violated the Brown Act, they're obligated to send a letter to the city saying, you violated the Brown Act, here's how you violated it, or at least how we think you violated it. And the city council has an opportunity to cure. The Brown Act is frankly not a difficult law to comply with. And oftentimes, even if we think that perhaps we're in the right, my advice to you may be to simply go through that cure process. All that means is we put it on a future agenda, we discuss it again, and we take another vote. It is potential to have criminal enforcement of the Brown Act. So if someone violates the Brown Act with wrongful intent to deprive the public of information, then they may be subject to criminal sanctions. I can only find one example of this when I was doing my research. This was the city council up in Northern California, where 3 members of the council would meet at the mayor's house before the city council meeting to discuss the agenda and how they were going to vote. And no, they got away with it the first time. They got their finger wagged at them by the district attorney, said you can't do that anymore. They said, of course, we'll never do it. And then they started meeting at the mayor pro tem's house. It's not a big city. It wasn't that hard to find what they were up to. And so in that case, they did have to face criminal charges for that. There were some updates. We do have new laws allowing remote teleconferencing. So if you are on business for the government agency, if you have a contagious disease, if you are suffering a medical condition that prevents you from coming into the city council meeting, we can teleconference you in under the AB 2449 provisions. AB 361, if we ever have another pandemic, we can activate those provisions and have remote meetings again. AB 992, this is one of the attempts of the legislature to keep up with technology. So there are a lot of closed Facebook groups that are community-wide, and they actually end up being sort of the town square for the community. City council members are prohibited from engaging with each other on those social media platforms, which is a way of talking about business of the jurisdiction. Or, and I think how did they put it? Thank you, yes. Responding in any way to a communication. No liking each other's posts. That's the short version. Because if one member of the council makes a statement about an item on the council agenda, and then another one likes that post, you have now communicated about that item, right? And then the last thing I would talk about, just to make sure we get it in the agenda that we discussed it, is the Levine Act. So the Levine Act was a provision of state law that didn't used to apply to city councils. And what it says is that if you have a certain amount of campaign contributions, in this case, over $250 from a single source, $500 as of January 1st, thank you, Madam City Clerk, $500 as of January 1st, you are prohibited from engaging in a decision on that applicant. So we talked about the personal financial interest and requiring disqualification. The Levine Act extends that to campaign contributions. And so we are actually going to be making sure that we have Levine Act disclosure language on the agenda so that the city council and any applicants are aware that if they've made campaign contributions, the applicant needs to disclose that because they're the ones who are in the position to know best. Because oftentimes you may get a campaign contribution from a person. That person may have an ownership interest in a corporation that has an application before the city council. There's really no way to know that on our end, the city end, or even your end. That would be something that the applicant would need to disclose. So we'll be getting that language added to the agenda. That concludes our mandatory ethics training. It's already on the agenda. Thank you. She's just on the ball with this. Thank you.
I have a question. let's say that you've scheduled a vacation in between meetings, and something comes up that you have to hold a special council meeting. Is there any way that that person can participate in that meeting?
Yeah, so there is still the standard remote teleconferencing rules that would require that you post the agenda at the remote location that you're at. I've had council members post it in hotel lobbies. I've had council members post it on the door to the cabin of their cruise ship. I don't think any member of the public is going to be interested in attending
Yeah.
because the public has to be able to attend to that remote teleconferencing location if they want to. I've never found a member of the public that wanted to. But we could absolutely do that.
Okay,
Depending on the reason for the delay, we may also be able to do the AB 2449 provisions, like I said, which don't require the posting of the agenda or the public ability to participate at that location. So, for example, if you were prevented from traveling because you had an illness, right? That would allow us to engage in that. Or if you were traveling to take care of a family member. So it's always going to be fact-driven. I would say just make sure you give us as much advance notice as you can.
okay, thank you.
Yep. Mayor, I have nothing further unless the council has questions.
Any questions? All right. Well, that concludes our training. Thank you, Stephen. And with that, we will adjourn, and the time is 4:07.